itself for short, extended periods of time, that's one more thing we want to do. So quickly elaborate a little bit more about what these things mean and how they kind of might apply to the reef systems. I'll give you examples of these in our own systems, right? So when we talk about system reliability, essentially we're talking about reliability of the individual components and reliability of how they are arranged within the system. Right? So I could have components in my system that are essentially arranged in series, one after the other, one after the other, right? And in that kind of a situation, let's say each one of my components was 90% reliable. That means 90% of the time it would be working fine. If you have them in series, each one of them is 90% reliable. The complete system for those 4 pieces would only be 65% reliable. Okay? So that's coming from reliability theory. So what we take away from here is, I want to make sure that most of my systems, if they are in series, their series better be as short as possible. Okay? So every additional component in the series is going to decrease the reliability of my system. So if you have to put things in series, and we often have to, make sure that the individual pieces are reliable enough and your series are as short as possible. If you want to improve the reliability of the system, you can think of things in terms of parallel systems. So instead of having one component, I have multiple of the same components. Okay? And that way I create redundancy in my system, and for that complete system to fail, every one of those pieces would have to fail. Okay? So now in this situation, if each one of them had 90% reliability, okay, what's the probability that all of them will fail at the same time? And that number is very small. So there's a 99.9% chance that your system will still be running. So, but again, there's always trade-offs. Like I said, there's design trade-offs. If you want to go with a system with lots of redundancy built into it, you're going to spend more money, right? Now I need, instead of 1 pump, I'm going to use 2 pumps, right? So now I have to trade that off with costs. So for every one of these things, there'll always be this balancing act where you're trading off some part with another part, right? It's trading off, in this case, cost versus reliability. So if you think of this in terms of a reef system design, let's say you have your tank, you have your sump, right? And you have a pump feeding into the... Most people do this with 1 pump. If that 1 pump fails, right, your system failed. Right? You don't have any water circulation through the sump. Most of us put our skimmers in the sump. Now your water won't get skimmed. Okay, some people put their heaters in their sump. Now you don't have heated water going back to your tank. Right? A better strategy might be to use 2 smaller pumps to feed into the tank. Okay? That way, if one fails, the other one is still working for you. Right? So this is, again, an example of how you can draw from these basic engineering principles and apply them to a reef system. We talked about decoupling the systems. Make sure that your systems are decoupled so we don't have cascading effects. Right? So I can think of my reef system being a system for lighting, right? A system for water flow, a system for water replenishment, or a system for filtration, and so on. So all of these are various subsystems of my tank. Right? I want to try and make sure that the interaction between these systems is minimal. So if I design things properly, my lighting system shouldn't really be interacting with my water flow system. Some of my water flow things like water circulation through the sump, maybe that shouldn't really interact with my filtration system. Okay, I can have a separate system for filtration that doesn't interact with that. So when we start looking at these things, putting these designs up, looking at the interactions, try and minimize the amount of interaction between these components. That way you can avoid some of the cascading failures. So for each of these, once you've designed your subsystem, what you want to do is think about each one of the components in your system and try to, in your own head, formulate what are the modes in which this system can fail, or this component can fail. What is the probability of these failures occurring? we can always over-design a system. So things like when they send spaceships or the shuttles into space, right? Those systems have to be 100% reliable. So you can spend a lot of money on trying to make it that bulletproof, and even those have failed, right? So think about things like what's the probability of this event occurring? Okay. If it does fail, what is the implication? What is the risk associated with that failure? What is the downtime associated with that failure? How long will it take you to replace or repair something? Because that's going to have an impact on the system design. If you are like me, you live in a small town where there's no fish store around, okay? If something fails, I have to mail order it. Okay? That means it takes me at least 3 days. Okay? And if everything goes according to Murphy, things would fail on Friday, so I can't order it till Monday, right? So I'm looking at a week. So for certain components, I have to make sure that I have spares that I'm holding, and that's primarily because of the impact of downtime, how long it's going to take. How easy it is to replace. Okay, and then think about redundancy. So these are some of the things you want to think about for each subsystem, and then try to look at, well, how independent is that subsystem? So time to availability of parts for repair, time to get delivered, how sensitive things are, and analyze what the risk is. If my main pump died, what's the risk? If it comes out to that, hey, maybe in 3 days my tank will be completely wiped out, then I have to make sure that I don't let these events go up to 3 days. So I'll give you an example, okay, of kind of things. This is all from when I was designing my new tank 3 years ago. I had a chance to redesign my 500-gallon system. Start laying things out on a piece of paper. Right? So I was looking at this thing going, okay, how do I want this thing to work? Right? I was going to have a sump. Let's see if this light works. Oh, there it is. There. This is my sump. The sump was going to get hooked up to a pump. Water was going to get pumped into the tank. And you think about things like, oh, what's going to happen when the power fails? If the power fails, the water's going to get siphoned back into the tank. Right? So you want to make sure that the sump that you have will be able to hold the water that gets siphoned. And you start looking and saying, well, how do I prevent things like too much water being siphoned back? Right? So you start thinking about things like siphon breaks, things like check valve. So you lay it on a piece of paper and say, here's how my system is going to get arranged. This is all the plumbing that's going to look like. And then you kind of, what I do is always share this with my friends and say, hey, take a look at this. Okay? Because it's always helpful to have extra pair of eyes look at things. And then you look at this and all my friends say, oh, you don't want to put a check valve. Okay? I go, why? I mean, everybody says you put a check valve, it's going to stop the water flowing back. I said, well, you put a check valve in a salt marine environment, guess what? They never work. You get buildup of stuff inside the check valve, the flapper doesn't work well. And so, all right, so that leads you to say, okay, that's the point of failure. When you need the check valve to work, it's not going to work. Right? So, what do you do? Right, then you start thinking about siphon breaks. How do I put a siphon break in? And I'll show you an example of what that means. But while I was doing this, I said, you know what I'm going to do? I have such a big pump for my sump, for this pump. I'm going to tee off of this pump and hook up all my filtration to it. I hook it up so I can feed my carbon reactor, I can feed my phosphate reactor. Okay. So that's the decision I'm making, right? And one of the consequences of this is I'm tying up now two of my systems together. I have my main circulation loop now coupled with my filtration loop because I'm using the same pump to drive it. Okay? So the inherent risk that I have is if that main pump fails, all of that will not function either. Okay? So again, it's not that you shouldn't do these things. It's important to know that you did them, why you did them, and what would happen if they went up. Right? So what I did was, I said, okay, if all of that could fail, I went and bought an extra pump. Okay? And now I have an extra pump that I can swap out if things fail. Okay? And I have a much shorter reaction time. Right? The other thing that I realized doing all of these things is, I have several pumps in my system. The last time I did my tank, every pump model was different. Right? I looked for the one that was always on sale, and that's the one I bought. And pretty soon I was running my tank with 4 different brands of pumps. Now if I wanted to keep backups, I have to keep 4 different backups. So this time around I said, you know what? It's going to be the same brand of pump. So I have 3 darts that are running my water flow in my system, and they're all identical. Okay? They all have identical fittings put on them. Right? So I can swap a pump out, replace it. I only have to carry 1 spare. Unless, of course, more than one dies at the same time. But that likelihood is smaller than one of them dying. Right? So again, examples of some of the concepts that I talked about earlier. Right? So I purposely coupled up 2 of my systems. I know what the implications are. I know what the risk is. And I traded off again cost, right? So I only had to run 1 pump that drove everything.